Hello and welcome to Realpolitik Confidential Episode 6. I am your host Alex Krishan, and today we will discuss the episode entitled Empires of the Sea, or the End of the Freedom of Navigation. Today it is the 16th of June 2025 and this is episode 6. Let us begin with discussing what I like to call the liquid chessboard. Well, in the age of empires, the sea was power. But in the age of globalization, it becomes a highway. In the age of multipolarity, it may even become a battlefield. Across history, empires have fought not just for land but for water. The Roman Republic declared the Mediterranean its Mare Nostrum, or our sea. The British Empire built a navy that ruled the waves and the trade routes that defined modern capitalism. And the United States, for nearly 8 decades, upheld what we all came to call freedom of navigation. Not just as a legal principle, but as a pillar of world order. But now the tides are shifting. Today, that freedom is under threat. From coast guards turned into militias, from artificial islands turned into fortresses, and from ideologies that treat the open ocean not as commons, but as sovereign terrain. China is redrawing maritime maps. Russia is stalling the Arctic. Iran's proxies are lighting fires at sea. And the West is no longer the unchallenged guardian of the world's arteries. This episode is not about one war or one flashpoint. It's about something irrevocably deeper, the unraveling of a system we took for granted, the maritime order that makes globalization possible. In the next hour, we will trace how we got here, how the law of the sea became the battleground of our era, and what might replace it in a world where no one power can enforce the peace. Welcome to Realpolitik Confidential. This is Empire of the Seas, the end of the freedom of navigation. The year is 146 before Christ. The Roman legions have razed Carthage to the ground. The Mediterranean is now encircled by provinces flying the eagle of the Roman Republic. From the Pillars of Hercules to the coast of Judea, there is one power, one law, one sea, and that sea is Mare Nostrum, what the Romans so proudly proclaimed to be our sea. This wasn't metaphor, it was doctrine. For Rome, the Mediterranean wasn't just a means of trade or travel, it was a Roman domain. A liquid frontier guarded by galleys, where pirates were crucified and foreign navies were sunk. Order at sea was a function of imperial will. If you wanted safe passage, you got Roman approval, or Roman punishment. But Rome's decline foreshadowed a pattern we've seen repeated for 2,000 years. The sea, once locked under one empire's boot, became contested once more by barbaric corsairs, by Byzantine merchants, by the rise and fall of Islamic naval dynasties. The same Mediterranean became once again a zone of piracy, tribute, and religiously justified maritime war. When Venice grew rich, it tried to claim the Adriatic. When Portugal expanded, it tried to seal off the Indian Ocean. And when Spain stumbled upon the New World, it began dividing not only ground, but ocean, with the help of papal bulls and royal declaration. The idea of a free ocean, well, it simply didn't exist. Well, at least not yet. Came much, much later. By the 16th century, the age of exploration had begun, and what we call exploration was in practice an attempt to control global trade by controlling maritime checkpoints. Portugal seized Malacca, Goa, and Hormuz. Spain blockaded access to the Americas and demanded that any foreign ship pay or perish. These were state-sanctioned monopolies of the sea. The oceans were still ruled by canon and charter. England and the Netherlands were not yet dominant. They were early contenders and challengers. The result, war at sea. Dutch merchants, rich from trade with the East Indies, found themselves barred by Iberian powers. Their solution, well, warships and, funny enough, lawyers. Here comes Hugo Grotius and the Mare Liberum. In 1609, a 26-year-old Dutch jurist named Hugo Grotius wrote a legal treatise that would shape the very concept of maritime freedom. Mare Liberum it was called, or the Free Sea. Grotius argued that no nation could claim sovereignty over the ocean. The sea, unlike land, was too vast to be possessed, too fluid to be fenced, and too essential to be monopolized. He declared that the sea was a common highway of nations, meant for free exchange of goods and of people. His argument was not abstract, it was deeply political. The Dutch had seized the Portuguese galleon called the Santa Catarina, laden with silk and spices. Grotius was hired to justify the capture, but rather than simply defending it, he articulated a universal legal principle that undermined centuries of imperial maritime doctrine. Of course, as you would expect, not everybody agreed. England, for example, responded with its own version, called the Mare Clausum, or the Closed Sea. John Selden, a legal rival, argued that seas could indeed be possessed, just as you would possess forests or fields, for example. Sovereignty, he claimed, was not a matter of nature, but of enforcement. If a country could enforce dominion, it had a right to claim it. This was the fundamental divide between law and force, between the sea as a commons and the sea as a territory. A divide that, as we'll see, is still alive and kicking today in the 21st century. Now, let's move from the age of sail to the empires enacting force. The 17th and 18th centuries did little to settle the matter legally, but they did make one thing clear: power wins at sea. The Dutch, the British, and the French turned Grotius's dream into imperial doctrine, not by respecting the freedom of others, but by expanding their own trade empires. The so-called freedom of the seas became shorthand for "we're the ones doing the shipping, and don't you dare stop us." Britain's Royal Navy in particular made itself the de facto referee of global trade. Smugglers, pirates, and rival states were all subject to interpretation and inspection, unless, and this is a very important nuance, they carried a British flag. Freedom of the seas, yes, but only with British insurance, British cargo, and British routes. And yet, something new began to emerge. Even amid imperial hypocrisy, the idea of open transit began to take root in diplomacy. During the Napoleonic Wars, blockades became tools of economic war and resistance. After the Battle of Waterloo, nations began realizing that chaos at sea meant ruin at home. By the time the 19th century ended, a tacit understanding was forming among the great powers. Peace at sea was profitable. And here comes Pax Britannica, an informal order, or, funny enough, freedom through hegemony. This was the birth of the Pax Britannica. From roughly 1915 to 1914, the Royal Navy ruled every major ocean. And don't be fooled, it wasn't just a fleet, it was a global system of order. The steamships carried goods across the Atlantic. Gunboats patrolled the Yangtze River, and merchant codes were harmonized with Lloyd's of London. Freedom of navigation became not just a legal principle but a business model. But this freedom was enforced through domination. Britain could protect the seas because no one could contest them. The Opium Wars, the bombardment of Zanzibar, the blockade of Argentina, These weren't accidents, they were reminders that freedom, when guaranteed by empire, always carries a price. It was a golden age for traders, but not if you were a rival of the Royal Navy. And now, from Pax Britannica, we ended up with the Pax Americana. The 20th century shattered that system of Pax Britannica. 2 world wars proved that even maritime empires could be sunk. Germany's U-boats devastated Allied shipping. Japan's carriers rewrote naval warfare. And then, when the dust settled in the year of 1945, only one true naval power remained: the United States of America. With its aircraft carriers, naval bases, and Marshall Plan shipping lanes, the US became not just a superpower, but the maritime superpower. This was the start of the Pax Americana, a system where the US Navy patrolled every major trade route, secured access to energy transit choke points, and enforced the unspoken rule that no regional power should dominate its neighbors at sea. What Grotius had envisioned, the Americans now enforced. Not by consensus, mind you, but by force, law, and credibility. The idea of freedom of navigation became embedded in American worldview. From FDR's 4 freedoms to the Carter Doctrine, from President Reagan's convoy operations in the Persian Gulf to today's freedom of navigation operations, or FONOPs as they're known, in the South China Sea. The US has acted as the arbiter of maritime order. But crucially, it never ratified the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Now, instead, Washington relied on precedent, power, and presence. And while most countries signed up to the UNCLOS in 1982, including Russia, China, India, and nearly every EU member, the United States did not. The irony? Well, the US enforced a system it refused to join. And yet, UNCLOS formalized many of the concepts Grotius once dreamed of: the freedom of the high seas, the right of innocent passage, the delineation of exclusive economic zones, or EEZs, and the notion of shared heritage beneath the waves. For a time it worked. Maritime trade flourished. Global supply chains depended on uninterrupted passage. Oil moved from the Gulf to Japan. Grain moved from Argentina to Africa. Containers crossed oceans like clockwork. Freedom of navigation had become, at last, a norm. But, and it's a pretty big but, as we'll explore next, norms without enforcement are fragile. And the seas are no longer ruled by one empire or one consensus. Here we go to the age of codification, or law, power, and the myth of enforcement. The sea may be free in theory, but only as free as the guns that protect it. Or, funny enough, the lawyers who pretend they can. Now, the 20th century ended with what some called the rules-based international order. It was an era in which treaties, not torpedoes, were supposed to decide conflicts. Law would replace brute force. And nowhere was this more idealistically applied than at sea. In 1982, after nearly a decade of negotiation, the world signed a sweeping accord meant to define once and for all who owns what in the oceans. It was called the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS for short. And to this day, it remains the most comprehensive legal framework governing the seas. At its core was a bold idea. The oceans belong to everyone, and to no one. But like most noble ambitions, the devil was in the details and in the enforcement. Well, let's discuss the basics of UNCLOS, what the treaty actually says. Let's start with the fundamentals. UNCLOS formalizes several key zones of maritime jurisdiction. First, we have the territorial sea, that is 12 nautical miles from a state's coast. Here, the coastal state exercises full sovereignty, just like land territory, but must still allow innocent passages of foreign ships. Then we have the contiguous zone, that is up to 24 nautical miles out. Coastal states can enforce here laws related to customs, taxation, immigration, and pollution. Further away, we have the Exclusive Economic Zone, or EEZ, that is to say up to 200 nautical miles from shore. This is where states have special rights over natural resources such as oil, fishing, or gas. But, and it's pretty important, they cannot restrict innocent passage or overflight. Then we have the continental shelf. In some cases, a country's rights to the seabed extend beyond 200 miles, up to 350 nautical miles if they can scientifically prove that their continental shelf extends that far. And finally, the high seas. Beyond the EEZs, this is called the global commons. They're supposed to be open to all and owned by none. There is also a provision for archipelagic states like Indonesia and special rules for transit through straits like the Strait of Hormuz or Malacca, where even submarines are allowed to pass submerged. In short, UNCLOS is the constitutional charter of the sea. As always, we have here a confrontation of ideas. Legal idealism versus geopolitical realism. A treaty is only as strong as its enforcement, and here lies the problem. UNCLOS created mechanisms, tribunals, arbitrators, technical commissions, but no armed enforcement whatsoever. There is no maritime blue helmets force, no naval peacekeepers, no patrols flying the UN flag. The convention rests on voluntary compliance and peer pressure alone. What happens when power breaks the rules? Well, the answer came in 2016. As a case study, we'll take the South China Sea arbitration, PCA versus China. In 2013, the Philippines brought a case against China under UNCLOS provisions. The case centered on Beijing's 9-dash line, a sweeping maritime claim that cuts deep into the South China Sea, an area rich in fish, oil, gas, and, most important of all, shipping lanes. The Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague accepted the case. Over the course of 3 years, it heard evidence, expert testimony, and legal arguments. In 2016, the tribunal issued its decision. China's 9-dash line has no legal basis under UNCLOS. Features like Mischief Reef and Subi Reef, even with artificial structures, are not islands, and they do not generate consequentially EEZs. China violated the Philippines' sovereign rights, including by building military bases on reefs. It was a sweeping legal rebuke. It reinforced UNCLOS as a strong, coherent body of law, and Beijing ignored it, declared rather amused that the ruling was null and void. And consequently, they continued construction. They continued patrols. They continued warning off American and Filipino ships. The arbitration had no effect whatsoever except to expose UNCLOS's most glaring flaw. It depends entirely on political will. And here comes the United States, the defender of something they never ratified. The United States, ironically, has never ratified UNCLOS, as I said, Successive administrations from Reagan onward balked at provisions concerning seabed mining, royalties, and potential infringement on U.S. naval flexibility. Despite that, the U.S. Navy regularly conducts freedom of navigation operations, or FONOPs, explicitly based on UNCLOS principles. In fact, Washington treats most of UNCLOS as, let's say, customary international law, which it claims applies even without formal ratification. This creates a peculiar hypocrisy. The most powerful enforcer of maritime norms doesn't legally bind itself to them. Critics argue that this weakens UNCLOS by example. Others argue it gives Washington flexibility to challenge abuses without being bound by emerging revisions, such as the one pushed by China or Russia. Either way, it reveals an uncomfortable truth. Law at sea functions only when it aligns with power. Then we have competing interpretations. Let's look at how other powers interpret UNCLOS. Well, China insists that its historic rights trump certain UNCLOS provisions. It argues that foreign military vessels have no automatic right of passage in its EEZ, a view rejected by most Western legal scholars. Then we have Russia claiming that the Northern Sea route, which goes through the Arctic, is subject to Article 234 of UNCLOS, which allows special control over ice-covered waters. Moscow uses this to require permits, escorts, and even tolls from foreign vessels. Even India once challenged US FONOPs through its waters, arguing that military passage without consent was illegal, though it has since softened its stance. Brazil asserts unusually broad control over its so-called Blue Amazon, a vast EEZ that is over 5.7 million square kilometers in the South Atlantic. Here, Brazil enforces fishing bans and resource restrictions with its navy. What's emerging is not a unified interpretation of the law, but a patchwork of regional doctrines, even couched in legalistic language, but underpinned by national interest. The more this happens, the less meaningful UNCLOS becomes. Then we have another issue, the illusion of consensus. That is to say, norms only last when they're enforced. The legal foundation may be universal, but the political will to uphold it is not. The European Union frequently calls for a rule-based maritime order. Ocean nations have proposed a binding South China Sea Code of Conduct with little to no progress. The African Union supports UNCLOS but lacks the naval capacity to enforce fishing rights. And what about the United Nations itself? Well, it is mostly toothless at sea. It can convene conferences, publish reports, and even have media disputes. But it has no navy, no coast guard, and no coercive power whatsoever. This means that law at sea operates on the goodwill of states, or, alternatively, the deterrent power of navies. This leads us to a bitter reality. Where the law fails, force fills the vacuum. Then there's pirate justice, or 21st century realism, as I like to put it. In the early 2000s, Somali piracy surged in the Gulf of Aden. The world responded not with lawyers, but with warships, mind you. The EU's NAVFOR, NATO's Operation Ocean Shield, Chinese PLA and patrols all converged on the Horn of Africa. Shipping insurance dropped, hijackings declined. Why is that? Well, not because pirates were prosecuted in The Hague, but because destroyers started firing warning shots. It was a preview of what maritime enforcement really looks like. Coalitions of convenience backed by firepower. Now, let's apply that as an exercise of imagination to, let's say, the South China Sea, or the Arctic, or the Red Sea. And UNCLOS starts to look more like a flag of aspiration than a flag of governance. That is to say that law is a mirror of power, not a substitute of it. The age of codification, noble though it was, never solved the central dilemma. Who gets to decide what is legal at sea, and what happens when two large navies disagree on the matter? UNCLOS remains a towering achievement in international law, but its relevance depends not on its words, but on its enforcers. And as we enter a multipolar world, those enforcers, shocker, no longer agree. In the next segment, we'll leave the treaties behind and dive into today's most volatile maritime flashpoints. From Chinese bases to Houthi drones, we ask a very hard question indeed. That is to say, is freedom of navigation already collapsing in practice? One thing is painfully clear. The map of maritime law was indeed drawn in ink, but the new rules are being written in steel. We have flashpoints, places where the ocean boils. The rules may be written in New York or The Hague, but they're tested in the straits, reefs, and the narrows of the real world. In theory, the world's oceans are governed by law. In practice, they're governed by confrontation. And the 21st century's most dangerous flashpoints are not land borders but sea lanes. From the coastal reefs of the South China Sea to the freezing corridors of the Arctic, from the missile-choked Red Sea to the Strait of Hormuz, we're witnessing a return to the oldest logic in geopolitics. He who controls the seas controls the flow of power. Let's explore 5 maritime flashpoints where theory meets hard steel and law bends under pressure. First, we have the South China Sea, where law goes against fortresses. There is no more emblematic symbol of the crisis in maritime order than the South China Sea. Spanning over 3.5 million square kilometers and transited by a third of global shipping, this region is a geopolitical cauldron. It is claimed wholly or in part by China, Vietnam, Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, and Taiwan. At the center of the storm, we have the China 9-dash line, a sweeping, ambiguous claim rooted in maps from the 1940s. The 9-dash line asserts Chinese historic rights over most of the South China Sea, overlapping the EEZs of several of its neighbors. In the last decade, China has backed these claims with concrete. Literal concrete. Reefs have been dredged into artificial islands. Outposts have become fortresses, equipped with radar, anti-ship and anti-air missiles, runways for bombers and surveillance drones. Mischief Reef, Fiery Cross Reef, and Subi Reef, once uninhabitable shoals, are now military installations. In 2016, the Permanent Court of Arbitration ruled that China has no basis in law in its claims, but Beijing dismissed the decision as a piece of waste paper. Today, Chinese Coast Guard and militia vessels shadow, block, or water cannon Filipino boats attempting to resupply their own outposts. Vietnamese fishing crews are harassed. Malaysian oil exploration ships are buzzed by drones. American and allied navies still transit the sea, conducting freedom of navigation operations. But always, this happens under the threat of an incident, a miscalculation, or an engineered confrontation. The South China Sea is no longer an open highway. It is a contested battle space in peacetime. And it is only one of many. We have the Arctic for our second case. The frozen frontier becomes a toll road if you have it Russia's way. Once the domain of polar bears and icebreakers and intrepid explorers, the Arctic is fast becoming the newest global maritime flashpoint. Melting ice has now opened new shipping lanes, most notably the Northern Sea Route, or the NSR, which hugs the Siberian coast and could shave 2 weeks off the journey from Europe to East Asia. Russia, which controls nearly half the Arctic coastline, has seized the opportunity. Moscow claims the NSR is internal waters, not an international strait. It requires foreign ships to apply for permission, carry Russian ice pilots, and sometimes pay fees. In 2022, it even passed a law requiring military notification for foreign warships transiting the area. All of this flies in the face of UNCLOS and its transit passage principle. But who's going to enforce it? In Arctic conditions, only a few navies have ice-capable ships. Russia, meanwhile, has the largest fleet of nuclear icebreakers, Arctic bases with S-400 missile batteries, and ambitions to dominate the Arctic resource extraction trade, especially when it comes to oil and gas under the seabed. The Arctic isn't just melting, it is rapidly militarizing. And if the NSR becomes a de facto Russian toll road, it sets a dangerous precedent. Strategic waterways becoming private monopolies of states. Thirdly, we have the lovely Strait of Hormuz, the pulse of the petroleum age. Located between Iran and the Arabian Sea, the Strait of Hormuz is the narrow throat through which nearly 20% of global oil supply passes. Iran has repeatedly threatened to shut it down. Over the past 2 decades, the strait has seen tanker sieges by IRGC, naval shadowing and flyovers of US destroyers, drone swarm surveillance, and missile threats whenever tensions rise. In 2019, a Japanese-owned tanker was struck by a mine, sending sparks all across the region. For Iran, Hormuz is the shield and the sword, a means of deterrence against US or Israeli strikes, and a pressure valve when sanctions squeeze too tightly. For the West, it's a nightmare scenario. A temporary closure would spike oil prices and trigger an instant regional escalation. Hormuz is not closed, but it is under constant psychological siege, and every naval passage through it is now a political act. Then we have the Red Sea. Here we have all the fun stuff: drones, missiles, and hybrid naval warfare. In 2023 to 2025, the most dynamic maritime threat emerged not from a nation-state navy, but from a non-state actor. The Houthis, an Iranian-backed militia based in Yemen, began attacking commercial vessels in the Red Sea, one of the most vital energy and trade corridors linking Europe and Asia. They have been using anti-ship ballistic missiles, or explosive-laden drone boats, or long-range UAVs, and even shore-launched cruise missiles. They targeted tankers, container ships, and even US naval vessels. The logic was, unsurprisingly, hybrid. Part political protest against the Gaza conflict, and part coercive strategy to reshape the region, and part proxy war. What was the impact? Well, global shipping giants like Maersk or Hapag-Lloyd rerouted entire fleets around Africa. The Suez Canal lost over 50% of traffic. Insurance rates tripled. Delivery times doubled, and billions were lost. Coalitions formed, such as Operation Prosperity Guardian, led by the US, the UK, France, and even China, started protecting convoys. But now the genie is out of the bottle. One regional insurgency with mid-range missiles and Iranian help managed to reshape global logistics from shore. This is the new phase of maritime warfare. Not carrier battles or impressive naval movements like in the Second World War, but asymmetrical chaos. Then we have something rather overlooked these days. We have the Eastern Mediterranean. Here, energy, nationalism, and warships complicate the matter. The final flashpoint lies in the waters between Turkey, Greece, Cyprus, and Israel. Here, maritime law tangles like a fishing line, with ethnic disputes, energy politics, competing easy claims, and centuries-old rivalries. Let's get started. In 2019, Turkey declared the Blue Homeland Doctrine, Mavi Vatan in Turkish, asserting maximalist maritime claims, including parts of Greece's continental shelf and around Cyprus's gas fields. It signed a maritime deal with Libya's Tripoli government to create a sea corridor that slices across Greek waters, igniting outrage in Athens. Greek and Turkish warships have collided. Fighter jets have faced off in harassment actions. Cyprus's gas exploration vessels have been escorted by Israeli or French frigates. Turkey has deployed drones and armed survey ships. NATO is caught in the middle. We have two of its member states on opposite sides of a potential naval standoff. The Eastern Mediterranean is no longer just a political cockpit. It's a simmering zone of naval brinksmanship. And in a world where energy security is again paramount, this corner of the sea could spark the next major regional war. What's the pattern though? Well, the ocean is becoming a mosaic of controlled zones. These 5 flashpoints are not isolated. They are symptoms of a broader transformation. The sea is no longer a single open system. It is fragmenting into regional zones of control, each with its own rules, its own enforcers, and its own risks. The global maritime order, once centered on US hegemony and codified law, is being chipped away by a multitude of things, such as fortress building, legal reinterpretation, hybrid warfare, nationalistic doctrines, and the creeping normalization of militarized commerce. That's right, militarized commerce. We're getting back to the age of pirates and of sail ships and the East India Trading Company. If these trends continue, shipping lanes won't just be threatened by war. They'll be shaped by it. In conclusion, the ocean is getting smaller, but it's also getting deadlier. For centuries, the sea represented openness, freedom, movement, and escape. That is seen in our art, in our literature, in our poetry, in everything. But the 21st century is reversing the image. The sea is becoming claustrophobic, controlled, and policed. And the longer these flashpoints persist, the more they become precedents. What China does at Mischief Reef, others may try elsewhere. What Russia does in the Arctic, Turkey echoes in the Mediterranean. And if the Houthis can shut a naval corridor with drones, what could Hezbollah or Hamas or the Wagner Group do next? The rules are changing, but so is the game. Flashpoints define the future, and at sea the future is being decided by ships, not signatures. That comes with a heavy price. The economics of collapse, trade, tolling, and the end of cheap globalization are upon us. Maritime security isn't just a strategic concept, it's the invisible engine of the world economy. If the seas fracture, the world pays the price. Imagine a global economy where every bottle of water, every shirt, every smartphone, every bag of rice becomes 10% more expensive. Not because of inflation, not even because of oil prices, but because the sea lanes broke. This is not a hypothetical. This is the scenario creeping into reality. Since the late 20th century, the modern global economy has been built on a single assumption. Goods will move safely, quickly, and cheaply across the oceans. The assumption now looks dangerously outdated. The ocean, which became the highway of the world, the backbone of globalization, is now contested. Let us start with the basics. Over 80% of global trade by volume and over 70% by value moves by sea. That includes 90% of oil exports, over 95% of containerized goods, virtually all bulk commodities such as grain, coal, iron ore, or fertilizers. They all go this way. Sea routes are now the arteries of globalization. But like any artery, they can get narrow and extremely vulnerable. Most of the world's trade flows through just a handful of choke points. We've already mentioned some of them. The Strait of Hormuz, the Bab el-Mandeb, the Suez Canal, the Strait of Malacca, the Panama Canal, and increasingly the Northern Sea Route. Block or threaten even one, and the consequences ripple outward. If you think this is alarmist exaggeration, in 2021, a single ship, the Ever Given, accidentally wedged into the Suez Canal, blocking it. Guess what? It froze 9 billion of trade per day. 9 billion US dollars per day. As I said, this was a simple accident. Can you imagine what happens when disruptions are deliberate? The Red Sea, for example, is a very interesting case of insurance and rerouting. The answer to the question, what happens when disruptions are deliberate? Well, I'm afraid to say that we've already seen it. In late 2023 and early 2024, Houthi drone and missile strikes in the Red Sea caused shipping firms to pull out en masse. Maersk, CMA, CGM, Hapag-Lloyd, shipping giants, all of them rerouted via the Cape of Good Hope. What does that mean? Well, all of this added to the following numbers. Over 3,500 nautical miles extra to each trip. That is to say, 10 to 14 extra days of voyage time and 40 to 60% higher fuel costs. Insurers labeled the Red Sea a war risk zone, and premiums skyrocketed from $500 per voyage, for example, to over $100,000 in some cases. Multiply that across thousands of ships, and suddenly goods take longer to arrive and cost more than they do. Freight costs, once invisible, are now affecting everything from auto parts to baby formula. Globalization, it turns out, has a chokehold, and that chokehold is the freedom of the seas. Then we have the rise of the new toll lords. Russia, Turkey, Iran, three powers in particular, are experimenting with something once considered unthinkable, turning strategic waterways into cash registers. Russia, for example, through its control of the Northern Sea Route, is demanding ships apply for permission, use of Russianized pilots, and, as I said before, pay fees. They cite Article 234 of UNCLOS, a provision meant for environmental protection, if you believe. They're using it to justify economic control. In effect, they've created a state-mandated toll road on the open sea. Then we have Turkey, through its Montreux Convention, controlling the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles, and already regulating naval access. Now, under Blue Homeland, the doctrine that Ankara so bravely asserted, aggressive energy and commercial rights in contested area of the Aegean and the Eastern Mediterranean have become aggressively enforced. This is the demand by the Turkish of recognition of EEZs before energy contracts can proceed in the area. Iran is another example of such lovely practices. They've repeatedly threatened to block or restrict Hormuz, and while it hasn't yet implemented tolling, the implicit message is clear. The strait remains hostage to geopolitics. This isn't really piracy, but legalistic predation. Fee for passage, wrapped in flags and in doctrines. And if it spreads, it could signal the end of globalization and of the global commons at sea. This will result in a number of things. The rise of private security and the rise of convoys. What do I mean by that? Well, to cope, many commercial operators are turning to the oldest solution in maritime history: armed escorts. Private maritime security companies, once used to repel Somali pirates, are now booming again. Ships transiting dangerous routes now embark with ex-military guards, non-lethal deterrents like LRADs, and in some cases, classified evasion protocols. Meanwhile, navies are forming ad hoc coalitions. Operation Prosperity Guardian in the Red Sea, Japanese destroyers protecting Japanese tankers, the Indian Navy escorting Indian-flagged cargo in the Arabian Sea, and China sending PLA and frigates to protect its shipping through Houthi waters. These are not full blockades or wars, but they are a shift from global openness to armed transaction. Even commercial logistic firms now speak of risk corridors, high threat zones, and contingency lanes. The open sea is being replaced by maritime patchwork zones, secure, semi-permissive, and contested. What are the knock-on effects, you may ask? Well, to answer that, we need to talk about global prices, supply chains, and manufacturing. The economic implications are cascading. First, we have inflation. Transport cost increases translate into commodity inflation. Even a $100 hike per container means millions in aggregate global costs. In sectors like agriculture or electronics where margins are tight, this distorts pricing rapidly. Secondly, we have supply chain reconfiguration. Companies are diversifying routes and suppliers. The Belt and Road Land Corridor, that is to say, a network of rail lines from China to Europe, is gaining traction. Regional manufacturing is making a comeback, and friend-shoring and near-shoring are buzzwords again. Delays and reputational risks are yet another thing we should discuss. Businesses must now factor in a buffer stocks, contingency, and longer lead times, reducing the just-in-time efficiency model. This slows down innovation and responsiveness in one broad stroke. Lastly, we have inequality between regions. Developing nations, particularly island and coastal states in the global south, face disproportionate shocks. They don't have the naval capacity, nor the insurance leverage or convoy options that larger states do. They pay more, they wait longer, and are economically punished for instability that they didn't create. This could spell out the return of maritime mercantilism. At this point, we can come to a chilling conclusion. We may be entering the rebirth of maritime mercantilism, where sea routes are assets to be defended, taxed, and monopolized. This recalls earlier centuries, when navies escorted trade not out of altruism but for profit. If we continue on this trajectory, what we'll see is the following. We'll see national shipping registries consolidating under flags with naval protection. We'll see transit agreements tied to military basing rights. We'll see perhaps even a new class of sovereign maritime taxes, disguised as, I don't know, environmental fees or safety tariffs or even ice-breaking costs when it comes to the Arctic corridor. In this future, freedom of navigation will not disappear, but it will become a premium product, only accessible to those with guns, with lawyers, and or with the alliances to secure it. The hidden costs of a fractured maritime order are what all of this amounts to. For decades, the open ocean was the great enabler of cheap globalized capitalism. A single shipping container could circle the planet with predictable cost and timing. There are even phone apps that can show you that. That miracle was the foundation of the modern affluence through which the planet lived. But now, every threat to a strait, every tolling scheme and every drone launch from shore challenges the integrity of that miracle. The seas are no longer just about sovereignty, nor security for that matter. What they are about is cost, access, and inequality. If we lose maritime freedom, we don't just lose strategic balance. What we lose is affordable modernity. If I could sum it all up in a phrase, I'd say that when the seas fragment, so does the world economy. And globalization dies not with a bang, but with a bottleneck. In our last segment, we will discuss the unraveling maritime hegemony, or why every system built on dominance faces the same dilemma. What happens when the enforcer weakens, but the rules remain? For nearly 80 years, the United States Navy played an outsized role in guaranteeing what we came to call the freedom of navigation. Its presence was not just military, it was psychological. A carrier group in a region signaled that commercial shipping would be safe. A destroyer transiting contested waters meant that no state had a monopoly over the sea. This was Pax Americana afloat. And it worked, believe it or not because the US enforced every maritime law, but because it could have if it wanted. The mere threat of force was often enough. America's commitment to open sea lanes helped build the post-war economic order. From Japan to Europe, from Singapore to Dubai, global prosperity became tethered to US sea power. But in 2025, we can no longer speak of that dominance in absolute terms. We're now in the age of, and this is a very scary notion, maritime entropy. Well, that means we'll see a strategic overstretch. Let's start with the numbers. The US Navy still operates 11 nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, 9 amphibious assault ships, 92 cruisers and destroyers, and over 50 attack submarines. They also have a web of naval bases from Diego Garcia, Rota, Guam, Bahrain, Djibouti, Okinawa, and Yokosuka. These fleets remain formidable, but the demands on it are growing faster than the capacity of the US to respond. The US Navy is expected to deter China and the Western Pacific, while also patrolling the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf, while also monitoring Russian submarine activity in the Arctic and the Atlantic, while also escorting convoys through the contested straits, while also interfering in humanitarian disasters, regional crises, and show of force missions. All while, of course, because they weren't busy at all, modernizing an aging fleet and competing with budgetary constraints at home. Well, to the surprise of no one, we can safely assume that this is a teeny bit of strategic overstretching. And its echoes are that of the old imperial dilemmas of past hegemonic powers. Then we have shipbuilding lag and maintenance gaps. As you probably know, China is building naval vessels at twice the pace of the United States. What the US really faces is delays in aircraft carrier maintenance, such as the USS Gerald R. Ford, which entered services years behind schedule. We have submarine dry dock bottlenecks, especially in. We have frigate modernization programs that lack European equivalents, and we have aging hulls extending beyond designed service life, risking reliability and readiness in one broad stroke. Meanwhile, China's shipyards are producing advanced destroyers, the famous Type 055, amphibious vessels, and submarines at industrial scale. US admirals have sounded the alarm long ago. If current trends continue, numerical parity will shift fully to Chinese advantage by 2030, with quality parity not that far behind. In a world of multipolar pressure, the symbolic weight of a lone US carrier group is beginning to fade. Then there is the matter of political fatigue. Maritime supremacy is not just about steel, but also about political willpower. In the aftermath of Iraq, Afghanistan, and now Ukraine aid fatigue, the American public is showing clear signs of exhaustion with what some call forever engagement. A US naval collision with Chinese forces in the South China Sea or a missile strike from Houthis in the Red Sea could escalate the situation rather quickly. But it might not garner the domestic unity needed for a sustained response. Both allies and adversaries see this clearly. Washington is no longer the unquestioned guardian of global sea lanes, but a heavily armed negotiator whose bluff is increasingly being called all across the globe. Meanwhile, congressional dysfunction, God help us all, debt ceiling battles, and divided leadership erode Washington's capacity to act decisively in defense of maritime norms. What we can safely assume we are seeing is the optics of retreat. As you know, perception matters, and in maritime politics, absence is interpreted as weakness. Let's look at the 2023 to 2024 time span. The Red Sea convoy system was only activated after dozens of vessels were attacked. Some American freedom of navigation operations were cancelled or scaled back in the face of Chinese protests. Mediterranean NATO navies failed to stop Turkish harassment of Cypriot energy vessels, and Russian Arctic control zones expanded without serious challenges. Every failure to respond decisively becomes a precedent for others to push boundaries further. And even allies are hedging in on that. Japan is expanding its blue water navy. India is fortifying the Andamans, and France and the UK are increasing presence east of Suez, not just as adjuncts to American power, but as redundant systems in case Washington ever falters. We are re-entering a period not of necessarily US abandonment, but of maritime uncertainty. A twilight zone where no one actor agrees or guarantees the rules, and everybody adjusts the doctrine accordingly. Now, a question remains. What is lost when the hegemon weakens? Let's be clear. The US was never a perfect enforcer of the law of the sea. It engaged in blockades, unilateral sanctions, and used the Navy for coercive diplomacy. But what it also did, and the world should be thankful for it, is they deterred naval anarchy. It did keep shipping lanes open in places where no other navy could. It did suppress piracy, subsidize maritime security, and give small states resources against aggressive neighbors. UNCLOS had weight because the US, even without ratifying it, upheld its principles through presence. Now that presence is thinned, contested, and increasingly questioned. What's the consequence? Well, not just the loss of maritime freedom, mind you, but the loss of strategic predictability altogether. The collapse of a single hegemon doesn't produce peace. It produces power vacuums. And as we say here at Realpolitik Confidential all the time, reality hates power vacuums. So does the sea. And so does geopolitics. Now, what is clear is that we are heading towards maritime multipolarity. And if I were to describe what's about to happen in the next time span, is the interregnum is about to begin. So here we are, between eras. Too early to declare the rise of a new global enforcer, and too late to deny the decline of the old one. This is the interregnum phase, the moment when old power fades and new power rises, and no one yet commands the sea in full. This is a dangerous moment in history, because during interregna, every doctrine is tested, every alliance is stressed, and every power sees opportunity in ambiguity. The sea, once considered a stable arena of global cooperation, is becoming a contested chessboard of partial control. The new subpart will introduce those players, doctrines, and ambitions, whose filling the gaps and why their vision of the ocean may not be compatible. It is safe to say that the US did not invent freedom of navigation, but for 80 years it guaranteed it. And what comes next may not be freedom at all, but a return to maritime tribute, tolling and exclusion. Segment 5, subpart 2, will discuss the new player, maritime doctrine in the multipolar world. In the absence of a singular naval order, the seas have become a contested space, and also a contest of doctrines, not just of fleets. If the United States can no longer guarantee the rules of the sea, who will? The answer, at least for now, is everyone and no one. Welcome to the new maritime reality. That is to say, a mosaic of regional naval powers, each with its own fleet, its own strategy, and its own interpretation of what the sea is for. Here we will dissect the emerging doctrines of sea power from 6 rising players and what they tell us about the shape of global maritime power in the multipolar age. First, we'll go with China, with its fortress waters and expanding horizons. A Chinese strategic maxim could go like this: whoever controls the South China Sea controls Asia, and whoever controls Asia controls the future. China's doctrine is dual-layered. First, they have near-sea defenses, absolute control over the first island chain, Taiwan, Senkaku Islands, and the South China Sea. This includes the de facto sovereignty over contested waters via artificial islands, air defense identification zones or ADIZs, and aggressive coast guard presence. Then we have the second pillar of their doctrine, far seas protection. That is to say, to secure the maritime Silk Road, critical supply lines that stretch from the Persian Gulf to East Africa and onwards to Europe. They do have an increasingly impressive set of operational assets. They have the world's largest navy by hull count, that is 370 ships and submarines. They have rapid shipbuilding, including the O-55 Renhai class destroyers and the Type 003 aircraft carrier, or the Fujian. And they also have a growing nuclear submarine fleet. Chinese Coast Guard vessels, after all, outsized many ocean navies. Maritime militia is also a part of their strategy and capacity. That is to say, civilian vessels trained to disrupt, harass, and swarm foreign ships, blurring the gap between what is a combatant and what is a civilian. Then we have strategic infrastructure. They have dual-use ports in Gwadar in Pakistan, in Hambantota in Sri Lanka, in Djibouti, and potentially in Equatorial Guinea. They have the Beidou satellite navigation system, which is an alternative to GPS for precision targeting and tracking. They also have a different interpretation of maritime law. Their rejection of UNCLOS rulings contradicting historical rights. They also asserted the right to restrict military activity within China's EEZ, contrary to what the global norms say. And they also have a preference for bilateral over multilateral negotiation to divide and neutralize claimants. China's navy doesn't just protect its coast. It protects a maritime worldview in which the sea is not a commons but a space of privilege, hierarchy, and history. Our second case study is India, a reluctant leviathan turning outwards. As the saying goes, the Indian Ocean is India's ocean. India has long viewed itself as a continental power, but that is rapidly changing. Its doctrine has evolved into what they call Sagar, that is security and growth for all in the region. And more ambitiously, they have Mahasagar, or the Great Ocean Doctrine, which asserts India as the primary stabilizing force in the Indian Ocean region, or the IOR. What are the goals? Well, to ensure that the IOR remains free of external, and by external, that is to be read Chinese, dominance. To protect sea lanes that carry 90% of Indian trade and 80% of its energy imports, and to serve as net security provider for the Maldives, Mauritius, Seychelles, and East African states. What are the assets of India? How do they back this? Well, they have 2 aircraft carriers, and God, I'm going to butcher these names. They have the INS Vikramaditya and the Vikrant, with a 3rd aircraft carrier being planned to be built soon enough. Then they have nuclear-powered submarines, including ballistic missile-equipped SSBNs, such as the INS Arihant. They also have a growing number of stealth frigates, destroyers, and patrol vessels, long-range BrahMos missiles, and advanced maritime surveillance aircraft like the P-8I Poseidons. Now, they also have strategic partnerships. They are a core member of the Quad, with US, Japan, and Australia as members. They conduct trilateral naval exercises with France and the UAE, and they are said to be in talks for naval logistics bases in Oman, in Mauritius, and in Vietnam. Its legal stance is the following. It opposes freedom of navigation patrols without prior consent in its EEZ, reflecting a more conservative interpretation of UNCLOS. India is not yet a blue water hegemon, but its navy is built for maritime denial, choke point control, and regional dominance with a selective global reach. Then we have the Russians. We always go back to the Russians, don't we? Here, subsurface sovereignty and Arctic tolling are the name of the game. The Russians believe that, quote unquote, the Arctic is ours, and it has always been. Russia's doctrine is framed by bastion defense and Arctic expansion. What is bastion defense? Well, bastion defense is securing zones like the Barents Sea, the Sea of Okhotsk, and other places where Russian nuclear submarines can hide, patrol, and consequently, if the need arises, launch. They use anti-access and area denial A2AD systems, like the Caliber missiles or the S-400, or mines to control the area. They also have Arctic ambitions, as we already stated. They treat the Northern Sea route as internal waters, not as in an international strait. They enforce ice rules under UNCLOS Article 234 to require ships to use Russian icebreakers, pay tolls, and notify passage in advance. Their assets are 60 submarines, including 10 plus SSBNs. And I realized I never mentioned what that means. SSBN means Strategic Nuclear Submarine. They also have the world's only fleet of nuclear-powered icebreakers and a set of new Arctic naval bases, radar stations, and coastal defense networks. From a legal standpoint, and this will come to the surprise of absolutely no one on God's green earth, they recognize UNCLOS, but they push maximalist continental shelf claims. They passed in 2022 legislation requiring warships to notify Russia before NSR transit, and Russia is not projecting global maritime power in this case, but it is weaponizing geography, as it so often likes to do. It is rewriting the rules of Arctic transit and embedding naval strategy into its energy and climate policy. This will not be fun. Now we will discuss a bit of a pickle in which NATO finds itself. Turkey and the Blue Homelanders' maritime revisionism. As the Turkish once put it, the seas are the lungs of the homeland. Doesn't that sound nice? Turkey's Mavi Vatan, or Blue Homeland, is more than a doctrine. It is geopolitical identity. What is its scope? Well, it claims vast maritime zones in the Aegean, Eastern Mediterranean, and the Black Sea. It challenges Greek and Cypriot EEZs, and this is especially true around energy-rich zones. They also use the Tripoli-Ankara maritime deal, which was signed in 2019, to carve sea corridors through contested waters. What are their asses? Well, they have the TCG Anadolu, which is a drone carrier, equipped with TB3 UAVs and future naval UCAVs. They also have Turkish-made Milgem-class corvettes and stealthy equipped missile systems aboard this Milgem corvettes. They also have a new generation anti-ship missiles called the Atmaka, and submarine programs and sonar upgrades in effect. They also have a strong defense industry with minimal reliance on foreign systems. The legal stance, again to the surprise of absolutely no one, is aggressive unilateralism, much preferring the quote-unquote facts on the water over the possibility of arbitration. It also views energy exploration as a sovereign right, not a subject to EU or UNCLOS constraints. Turkey is not building a global navy, but it's building a coercive regional fleet, tailored to its geopolitical neighborhood. A more surprising addition to this list is Brazil, believe it or not. The guardian of the Blue Amazon, as they call it. Brazil's wealth is no longer just in the Amazon rainforest, but in the ocean that borders it. Brazil's Amazônia Azul doctrine is about protecting sovereignty, not projecting force. Its scope? Pretty simple in effect. Securing its 5.7 million square kilometers exclusive economic zone. Deterring illegal fishing, narco-trafficking, and resource exploitation by foreign powers. Its secondary or tertiary goal is to defend offshore oil rigs, now the source of over 60% of Brazil's oil production. What assets do they base this doctrine on? Well, the NAM Atlantico, refurbished from the UK Royal Navy. They have Scorpène-class attack submarines from France, indigenous nuclear submarine programs called ProSub, and expansive UAV and satellite maritime surveillance capabilities. It also fosters a number of partnerships. They have naval diplomacy with Portuguese-speaking African nations such as Angola, Mozambique, and Cape Verde. They also have training exchanges with Argentina, South Africa, and India. When it comes to its legal stance, they adhere strictly to UNCLOS and advocate for global South interests in maritime governance. Brazil's navy is not built for great power confrontation. It is a sovereignty shield, but one that could increasingly matter as the South Atlantic becomes a side of outside interest. We also have, like in any sort of event, middle powers and opportunists scrambling. In this new era, even non-hegemonic powers are carving small niches. We have Indonesia patrolling the Natuna Sea against Chinese encroachment. We have Iran strongly using asymmetry, that is fast boats, drones, missile-equipped corvettes to menace the Hormuz Strait. We have Egypt now fielding the largest navy in Africa, controlling the Suez Canal. We have South Korea, and it's shifting towards aircraft carrier acquisition to assert independence from US maritime cover. Australia investing in nuclear submarines with Indo-Pacific autonomy in mind, and a multiple number of other actors. What does this all form? Well, together they form a global network of naval autonomy projects, each seeking to ensure that no one tells them where and when they can sail. What we'll end up with is a doctrinal kaleidoscope with no shared compass. Each of these naval doctrines spring from local strategic logic, but together they form a dangerous pattern that is conflicting visions of what the ocean is for. China, on one hand, sees it as a historical space to be reclaimed. The US sees it as commons to be protected. India sees it as a sphere of stewardship. Russia sees it as a territory under ice to make money out of. Turkey sees it as a legacy to be asserted. And Brazil sees it as a resource frontier to be defended. UNCLOS, designed for universal norms, was not built to mediate between such competing paradigms. This is no longer a debate between the rule of law and brute force. It's a contest between worldviews, each with its own fleets, its own maps, and its own version of what freedom of the seas even means. This ends up in a mess of coalitions, of scenarios, and the question surrounding how the coming shape of the maritime world will look. The sea was once open because one empire kept it so. Now that no one can, we face a fundamental question. Who will sail where? And who will stop them? We've mapped the decline of the American maritime hegemony. We've charted the rise of regionally ambitious navies, each with a doctrine and a fleet. And now we turn to the axis of this evolving order: coalitions, contingencies, and the future shape of maritime governance. The truth is stark. The world no longer agrees on what maritime freedom means. And so, consequentially, like any political vacuum, the seas are now splitting into blocks. That is to say, we have officially entered the bloc era. Coalitions of law against coalitions of interest. First, we have the liberal maritime bloc. Its core members could be named as the United States, Japan, Australia, India, the United Kingdom, France, select EU and Ocean states. Its principles, well, UNCLOS as a foundational, even when not ratified in the case of the US. Then we have defense of freedom of navigation as a global right, opposition to grey zone coercion, for example, opposition to China's Coast Guard tactics or the Houthis' missile harassment, with varying degrees of success. What is the tool set and what are the actions of this coalition? Well, freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea, in the Taiwan Strait, and in the Black Sea. multilateral naval exercises such as RIMPAC, Malabar, La Perouse, and Cobra Gold, and ad hoc convoy coalitions such as Operation Prosperity Guardian in the Red Sea, NATO patrols in the Med, and EU NAVFOR off Somalia. What are the challenges they face? Well, a lack of a formal structure for one, or universal commitment, divergent interests among the members, for example, India's cautious approach to US-led security frameworks, and there is also the risk of overextension as coalition members cannot be present in all theaters simultaneously. This bloc keeps the ideal of open seas alive, but its reach is increasingly reactive, not preventive. Then we have the strategic autonomy axis. Its core members are China, Russia, Iran, opportunistic alignments with Turkey, Syria, and North Korea, or Venezuela, for example, are also a fact. Its principle, well, UNCLOS as a selectively applicable framework, national sovereignty over contested maritime zones, tolerance for paramilitary enforcement, such as maritime militias, quote-unquote fishing fleets with guns, or privateers, and sea control as a function of historical entitlement or deterrent necessity. What are the tools and what are the actions of this coalition? Well, they are the following. Joint naval drills, such as the ones between China, Russia, and Iran in the Indian Ocean, and Mediterranean patrols as another relevant example. They also have port diplomacy, Belt and Road Maritime Corridor, the China base in Djibouti, and potential Atlantic footholds in the Equatorial Guinea. They also engage in legal warfare, reinterpreting EEZ rules and rejecting tribunal rulings. What are the strengths of this alliance? Well, they're all united by a unified, shared distrust of Western maritime norms. They also are flexible, informal in their cooperation, and its cooperation is based on a mutual threat perception. They also are very effective at using hybrid maritime tactics. That is to say, utilizing unmanned vessels, port depth diplomacy, and naval proxies. This bloc is not yet formal. You will not find it in any sort of treaty whatsoever, nor in any sort of agreement. But it doesn't have to be. Its strength lies in coordination without visibility, designed to challenge liberal assumptions, one choke point at a time. Thirdly, we have swing states and regional hedges. These are states like Indonesia, Brazil, Egypt, South Korea, the United Arab Emirates, or South Africa. These states support UNCLOS in principle, avoid entanglements in major bloc politics, and build up autonomous naval capabilities to protect economic exclusive zones and sea lines of interest. Their strategic behavior is pragmatic and not ideologic. They conduct exercises with both US and China as their interest serves. They host rival bases in parallel, such as Djibouti, which hosts both US, Chinese, and France naval presence. They engage in UN maritime dialogues while asserting maximal national control. These actors may be the tip of the balance of the future maritime order, depending on where they align when conflicts escalate. And now the return of hard power, the immovable fact of the hour. From paper treaties to armed logistics, that is a transition that we see. In the past, sea power was often about symbolism. That is to say, the presence of ships, of flags, and of protocols. Today, it is returning to kinetic relevance. The key trends are convoy tactics, such as the situation in the Red Sea, or the Strait of Hormuz, or the South China Sea for that matter, armed merchantmen which I find, on a personal note, positively hilarious because it's something straight out of a Pirates of the Caribbean movie. Armed merchantmen, meaning the increase in the debate over whether commercial ships should be allowed to carry self-defense weapons. We have the naval militarization of commerce, that is Coast Guard units outfitted with ship killer missiles, container ships doubling as surveillance platforms, and all sorts of new sort of technological upgrades. Then we have insurance discrimination by, for example, the Lloyd's of London, which now ties premiums directly to naval presence in a given zone. Effectively, we're witnessing the reintroduction of armed trade routes where economic throughput depends on military escort, intelligence sharing, and alliances of convenience. The doctrine of innocent passage is mutating into conditional passage. Now let's look at a few scenarios for the future. I see three potential roads ahead. Let's game them out. Let's game these three most plausible futures for maritime governance. The first scenario is not fun at all. It's the balkanization of the seas. In this world, every strait is a potential toll booth in this scenario. Every passage requires boat permission and financial compensation. This scenario features the world splitting into maritime zones controlled by regional powers. It features Hormuz becoming an Iranian checkpoint, the South China Sea becoming a Chinese security zone, Russia monopolizing the North Sea route, and Turkey dictating EEZ access in the Eastern Mediterranean. What are the potential consequences of this hypothetical scenario? Well, shipping becomes slower, more expensive, and more politically entangled. Naval skirmishes increase, especially between middle powers and private security forces. Smaller states without navy-to-navy relationships suffer economic marginalization, and UNCLOS becomes effectively a piece of toilet paper. What are the winners? Who are the winners of this potential scenario? Well, regional hegemons with coastlines, navies, and legal leverage. Who are the losers? Well, everybody who's not that. Respectively, the global commons, landlocked economies, and liberal maritime principles. The second scenario is armed globalism. Freedom of the seas surviving only by force. This scenario features major powers continuing to enforce open navigation through permanent naval task forces. The sea becoming a 21st century version of Cold War airspace. Monitored, layered, tense, but begrudgingly still open. Military alliances guaranteeing trade through corridor defense in the SLOC, or the sea line of communication patrols, and private security firms expanding into de facto convoy providers. Consequently, globalization would survive but becoming costlier and more militarized. Major navies would see the revival of Cold War logistics, underway replenishment, forward basing, and anti-submarine warfare being the name of the game, and maritime neutrality would disappear and crumble, every merchant ship sailing with implicit allegiance. Who are the winners of this scenario? Well, naval alliances with interoperable doctrine, and the losers, obviously, non-aligned states, low-income traders, and fragile maritime peace. The third scenario is, and I am rather, how shall I put it elegantly, reluctant to believe in this scenario, an age of normative renaissance. That is to say, the sea being re-legalized by consensus and not coercion. What the scenario features is a renewed commitment to UNCLOS enforcement mechanisms, new agreements on unmanned maritime systems, Coast Guard deconfliction, and data transparency. An ASEAN-China Code of Conduct becoming enforceable, African maritime treaties consolidating surveillance zones, And this would, of course, result in the following consequences, respectively: reinvestment in international institutions such as UNCLOS, IMO, and IHO, states agreeing to bind arbitration in EEZ disputes, great powers restraining unilateralism in exchange for diplomatic influence. Who would be the winners in this unlikely scenario? Well, the rule of law states, diplomatic institutions, and collective governance. And the losers would be coercive actors that rely on ambiguity and grey zones. What will most likely happen, in this humble analyst's opinion, is the following. The world will not choose one of these futures. It will live inside all three simultaneously. The South China Sea will reflect balkanization, the Red Sea will require armed globalism, and perhaps in the South Atlantic a normative renaissance may take root through Lusophone and Latin American maritime accords. The sea will become a jurisdictional kilt, not a seamless fabric. This is the future of maritime multipolarity. Fractured, militarized and contested, not by pirates but by legal arguments, precision missiles and geopolitical maps drawn in ink and enforced in steel. And now for everybody's favorite segment, that is to say, the big picture, where the tide breaks. A storm is clearly coming, and it's not going to be a typhoon, but it's going to be a systemic shift. It's not the end of history, but the end of free passage as we know it. It all began as an idea, and a radical one at a time, that no nation, no empire, and no armada would lay claim to the open sea. It was Grotius in 1609 writing Mare Liberum, declaring that the oceans belonged to no king and that principle that trade should not kneel before a crown. It became real when the British enforced it with broadsides. It became normalized when the Americans upheld it with carrier groups. And it became universal when the world codified it into law. UNCLOS, maritime tribunals, the quiet promise that no matter how divided the continent may be, the seas would remain open. For centuries, freedom of the seas has been more than legal doctrine. It has been the spine of globalization, the circulatory system of the global economy, and the stabilizing logic of modern civilization. But now, that spine is cracking rapidly. What we will see is the fracturing of maritime order. We're actually already witnessing it today, and it is not an anomaly. And it is neither a temporary disruption. And it is certainly not a shipping challenge or a series of isolated security incidents. What we are witnessing is the slow tidal unraveling of the maritime commons across every latitude. Armed drones hunt tankers in the Red Sea. Coast guards in the South China Sea act like destroyers. Russia charges tolls in the Arctic. Iran openly threatens to close Hormuz. Western navies scramble to defend routes they once took for granted. The very concept of innocent passage is dying, not in treaties, but in practice. And the world's response? A patchwork of convoys, insurance hikes, rerouted traffics, diplomatic protests, and at best armed reactions to symptoms, not solutions for causes. The multipolar sea is the de facto reality. Let us be brutally clear, as we so enjoy to do here at Realpolitik Confidential. The ocean is now multipolar, and it is multipolar in the most strategic sense possible. This doesn't mean a utopia of shared governance. What it means is doctrinal clashes between regional visions of the sea, weaponized legality where nations cite their own maps, their own histories, and their own tribunals as arguments in disputes. Zone-based coercion, where freedom exists only when it's explicitly militarily defended, and a hardening of choke points into zones of naval clashes. What UNCLOS called the commons, multipolarity calls contested. And the balance of power at sea no longer favors one ideology. It favors who is willing to build, patrol, and risk. So what if we lose, if the sea breaks? Let's forget that theory, let's talk about actual impact. If the sea ceases to be free, the world economy begins to suffocate. That is to say, global shipping routes slowing or rerouting altogether. Oil prices spiking with every drone swarm in Hormuz. Isn't that a reality these days? And food insecurity rising as grain from the Black Sea or Argentina become harder to ensure and harder to move. We also have the semiconductor in your phone taking longer and costing more. That is to say that the little device you're pretending to listen to me on is going to cost way more than it already does. Why is that? Well, because its components crossed 4 oceans. And each of these 4 oceans will now be taxed by risk. But this is more than economics, it's geopolitical entropy, and in geopolitics there are very few words scarier than entropy. That is to say that without shared norms at sea, small states become more vulnerable. Middle powers must arm or align, and great powers face miscalculation every time a patrol crosses a line. In short, the absence of maritime order breeds terrestrial instability. And make no mistake, the oceans are not a buffer anymore, they are a battleground in waiting. We have many possible futures, but I'm afraid that none of them are clean. What comes next? Well, we must prepare for a world in which maritime freedom is no longer assumed but negotiated route by route, ship by ship, and crisis by crisis. And that world could take the three overlapping shapes that we've already mentioned. That is to say, armed globalization, where convoys, escorts, and high insurance are the norm, and trade survives, but militarized. Then we have the neo-mercantilist fragmentation. Straits become toll booths and EEZs become private areas. The map becomes a minefield. And then we have the rather optimistic scenario in which we see a normative pushback. Coalitions fight to reassert global rules. That is to say, we'll see UNCLOS 2.0 alive and well. It will be AI-enforced vessel tracking extravaganza. And maritime courts will have teeth. None of them are guaranteed, but all are better than the fourth option. Collapse. I say again, collapse. An ocean ruled by incident, provocation, and escalation. And let us be honest to ourselves. We're already halfway there. What needs to happen? Well, this is where realism meets imperative. If the global order is to survive on the water, then we need the following. We need naval investment being strategic and not nostalgic. Carriers alone won't secure S-locks. We need interoperable fleets, drones, undersea sensors, and intelligence fusion. International law must evolve. UNCLOS must be updated for autonomous ships, artificial islands, and maritime militias. Enforcement must be real and not symbolic. Middle powers must lead. The US cannot and should not do it alone. India, Japan, France, Indonesia, Brazil, all of them must help stitch together maritime order across their regions. Coalitions must deepen, not widen. Phone ops should be multinational. Convoys should be integrated. And choke points should be defended not just by military might, but by diplomatic unanimity. Transparency must become core doctrine. The age of deniable maritime coercion must end. Every blockade, drone, grade zone, and all these fun stuff must be documented, exposed, and punished economically or otherwise. Because if not, we wake up one day and find the ocean no longer connects us, but divides us. Well, you're gonna ask me, what exactly are you talking about, Alex? You've been talking now for almost an hour and 40 minutes. What's the big picture? Well, my dear listeners, the big picture is the following. The ocean was never empty. It was held open by empires, by law, by assumption. Now we see what happens when those assumptions erode. The big picture is this. We are sailing through a narrow window in history. The unipolar maritime order is gone. The multipolar order is forming, but it's unstable. And the sea, long the symbol of openness, is becoming a canvas of confrontation. We're not predicting World War at sea, but we are predicting a future where your shipping container, your fuel shipment, your nation's strategic autonomy depends on maritime security more than ever before. Freedom of the seas was never free, but we may soon discover what it costs to lose it. Empires of the sea rise and fall, but the oceans remain. What changes is who controls it, and whether the rest of us can still pass through. This has been Realpolitik Confidential Episode 6, Empires of the Sea, the End of the Freedom of Navigation. I have been your host, Alex Krishan, and thank you for listening. May God keep you all safe in these troubled times, and we'll see each other soon. Goodbye, and have a very lovely day.